Okay, this is the third and last video of the Maslow lecture. I did discover that 15 minutes is all you get. 15 minutes per video is all you get with the free version, which is just fine. So we had left off talking about the traits of a self-actualized person, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about what peak experiences are because they're pretty common in people who are self-actualized, but other people have them as well. So peak experience, the way to think about them, they're not all that rare. Mild forms may be reported by up to 35-40% of people. And it's this just powerful experience of awe and wonder and both ecstasy and peace at the same time. And this isn't meant to come from any kind of substance. This is just a natural experience that people have. And some examples might be having the birth of your child, or I don't know if you've ever been to the Grand Canyon. I have not, but there is this platform that you can walk over and just kind of hang over the edge like that, or just the platform feels like it's hanging over the edge. But they can also be in much simpler things like, just being out on a fall day and seeing a beautiful tree, really connecting with someone and that feeling you get. So the people who are more likely to have peak experiences, Maslow says, are usually more intelligent, more assertive, more imaginative, self-sufficient, and relaxed. And they're also more socially concerned and less materialistic. So in some ways, people who have peak experiences are more likely to have characteristics of self-actualization, but they don't necessarily have to be at that point. Here's an example. This is just a quote by Maslow that talks about what peak experiences are like. Feelings of limitless horizons opening up to the vision, the feeling of being simultaneously more powerful and also more helpless than one ever was before. The feeling of ecstasy and wonder and awe, the loss of placement in time and space with, finally, the conviction that something extremely important and valuable had happened, so that the subject was to some extent transformed and strengthened even in their daily life by such experiences. So that's pretty wordy, but if you break it down and look at it, it really makes a lot of sense. Just an unusual feeling that we don't necessarily have all that often. Okay, this next slide, we've already gone over this, the number of people that report them, and some of the characteristics of peakers. This is a video, again, if you go on the slides that I've attached to Blackboard and click on this, this is a climbing of Mount Everest, summiting the peak of Mount Everest, and just the person looking around, kind of a 360 view. And you do not have to climb Mount Everest to have peak experiences. That's not what we're saying. But if you did, it certainly would be a peak experience. So a little bit more about people who are self-actualizers, or the ones that Maslow identified as self-actualizers. They can have some negative qualities. They're not perfect by any means. They have a tendency to be somewhat irritable, depressed. They are not necessarily happy, as I mentioned, because self-actualization involves pain. It involves being aware of being in a world that's not necessarily perfect. Yet they do attempt to grow in response to the pain. This is a person who feels and thinks very deeply. And there's some evidence that they may be kind of cold regarding interpersonal conflicts. So a person, when they decide they want a divorce, they may seem somewhat ruthless if they see they no longer love their spouse, or they may recover from deaths of others to even appear somewhat heartless. And again, that's partly because most of their needs are being met at a lower level. So there's not exactly perfection there by any means. Now, I want to talk about some of the people that Maslow identified as being self-actualizers. Abraham Lincoln was one of them. And then this kind of tickles me a little bit. The people he said are certain self-actualizers. Thomas Jefferson, so ignore that whole slavery thing, apparently. He came up with this in the 50s. Albert Einstein, and then Eleanor Roosevelt, he said, were certainly self-actualized. People like Benjamin Franklin and Walt Whitman came pretty close, but not quite. So, if you look at his criteria, some of the things they have in common, it's hard to imagine all these people to some extent don't have that. any of these people personally. The list was formed just via global holistic impressions that he had of people. And, the biggest problem is that all these people on this list were people he personally admired. So if you think about the operational definition of self-actualization in Maslow's theory, it relies pretty much on his own subjective values, which has some problems. He also really didn't address how self-actualizing concepts are acquired. Do you inherit them? Does it come from your environment? He wasn't real specific about that. So we're kind of left with the idea that it's probably a pretty biased sample he's got there. If you were to look up self-actualizing now, you'd still find lots of information and lots of research studies about them. Maslow's theory has been adapted somewhat in more recent years to be a little bit more contemporary. So here's one example. This came from the early 2000s. So some of the lower needs are the same: the physiological, the safety, belongingness and love, esteem. But then some researchers are thinking there's a gap between the esteem needs and self-actualization. And so they envision that we have cognitive needs. We have needs for meaning, self-awareness, knowledge, information, more intellectual kinds of needs. And then we also have aesthetic needs. So this would be needs for beauty, for image. It says balance and form. So when you think about aesthetics, that has to do with something, the way something looks like and the way something is imagined. And then self-actualization at the very top. This model hasn't particularly gained a whole lot of steam, but this is just one of the ways to bring Maslow's theory into more contemporary times. Another way to bring his theory into contemporary times is to look at how we can apply his theory. There's lots of ways. I just want to mention a couple. One having to do with career, and then the other having to do with employee motivation. So let's start off here with career. We know that career choice during the Depression had a much different idea of how to make career choice. So the emphasis then in the 1920s was on finding a job that was safe, a job that was going to allow you to help take care of your family, that was going to give you benefits and security. And it really was all about ensuring survival. And so the emphasis then was that you took a job that met your physiological needs and your safety needs. And that was pretty much all you did. So you didn't, during this time especially, see people pursuing jobs that fulfilled themselves or that they thought used all their talents. They were just trying to survive for the most part. And now we tend to take this kind of stuff for granted, at least in our country and in a lot of Western kinds of countries. So we take that security for granted, and we can focus on and choose a career that allows for our self-exploration, that allows for esteem needs and those self-actualization needs. So the exercise I gave you, where I asked you to pick a couple of occupations and to say what meta needs those careers meet, that's not something that our grandparents or great-grandparents would ever think of. So one fun thing to do might be, if you're able to ask your grandparents or even your great-grandparents about their dream job growing up. And chances are good, whatever their dream job was, they weren't really able to pursue it because the emphasis on careers were just very different now. And especially when you look at families where the parents are immigrants, the parents' idea of what might be a good job would be sensible, something that provides security. And the child, who may be much more Americanized in terms of culture, acculturated, has something more in mind, something loftier for themselves. Or look at Maslow's self-actualization, has to do with employee motivation. Companies that have smart managers and smart CEOs understand that performance is directly linked to job security. So employees won't perform unless they feel secure in their jobs. And of course, that makes sense. But secure employment is more than just salary and money. We know that people will work for less salary if some other kinds of things are met. You think about Maslow's hierarchy, so the safety and the physiological are met by salary, but you can make money doing a lot of different things and not necessarily in a particular job that you're in. They want something more. They want to be able to express themselves in their work and make a contribution to their work and the company's goals. One example of this that's been studied has been Southwest Airlines, and as far as being an employer. Southwest Airlines has a history of low employee turnover. At least this was pre-COVID. Really, they don't lay people off, and they make their employees feel very valuable. So most companies, to get people motivated, they'll do things like threaten layoffs. But Southwest has always found a different system to do that, and you can read about that online if you're interested in that a little bit more. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. When we meet again in class on Wednesday, we're actually going to just take a quick look at an evaluation of Maslow's theory. So I will see you then.